Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. On this episode, I'm exploring the concept of circularity. This is the idea in the context of sustainability that a product is created with its own end of life taken into account. In other words, the businesses take responsibility not just for producing an item, but for what happens after it reaches the end of its useful life. In a circular economy, once the user is finished with a product, it goes back into the supply chain instead of to landfill. My guest on this episode is Chris Houghton. Many years ago, Chris and I worked together in financial services regulation. And while I moved into human risk, he went on to work in energy and consumer products and is now an advocate for circularity, which forms the basis of the business that he runs. Chris is the CEO of T-Mill, the world's first open-source closed-loop apparel manufacturer. I'll let him explain what that means, but it's basically a way of manufacturing clothes that reduces the carbon footprint and waste. And there are two reasons I think this is interesting from a human risk perspective. The first and most obvious is the climate emergency. As Chris explains, but which came as news to me, apparel is one of the largest industrial producers of carbon emissions. I knew fast fashion was bad, but I didn't realise quite how bad. The second is the innovative thinking that's gone into the business model he runs. If we want to solve problems, whether big ones like the climate emergency or smaller everyday business ones, and reduce human risk, then we need to think creatively. As Chris explains, T-Mill has shifted away from the conventional logic that is deployed by the majority of the apparel industry. Most obviously, the idea that you produce clothes speculatively in the hope of selling them, rather than only producing them on demand. When I first heard Chris talking about the business, I was reminded of the quote often attributed to Einstein: "We can't solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them." That's sometimes easier said than done, so I'm hoping that hearing how one company does it can inspire others. Before we begin, my usual reminder, or if you're a new listener, in which case welcome, here's some exciting news for you. My new book, Humanizing Rules, Bringing Behavioral Science to Ethics and Compliance, is available to pre-order now. There's a link in the show notes. If you do that before it's released at the end of March, you'll get access to exclusive content that'll help you get the most out of the book. With that said, back to this episode. Please enjoy, as I know you will, my conversation with Chris Houghton on circularity. Chris, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Thank you very much.
I'm really excited to have you here. Look, you and I know each other really well, but many of my listeners might not know you. So can you tell them a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I studied witchcraft at university, and that naturally led me into accountancy, which is sort of the background to which, we know each other. I became an accountant through a lack of imagination, but it gave me a really good grounding in terms of, how the world works, flows, money, people, industries, sectors, et cetera, and then that led me to think more about purpose, really, and how I could have some impact and look back on a life well lived and something that I'm proud of. So having some form of positive impact in the world became more and more important to me. I jumped out into the world of energy and worked for one of the first independents that with a focus on green energy and sustainability, so OVO Energy that was. And then having left there, felt that I wanted to focus on sustainability in other areas. And that leads me to where I am currently today with T-Mill, where we're focused on ending waste and currently ending waste in the world of apparel, but hopefully extending that to anything and everything.
A fascinating career that's taken you into lots of spaces. And I love that sense of purpose that you talked about there, because I think when, and I started as an accountant as well, it's like there's a sense of you understand the engine room of business in theory, but in many respects, it's just sort of fulfilling a function without really delivering any. In other words, you're instantly replaceable and you're just doing something that it's almost like a sausage factory, particularly sort of at the audit and advisory thing, where it's just moving on to the groundhog day of the next thing. And so I love this idea that you start to see what the world's going. You fall into that as a logical career, and then you kind of go, well, I want to do a little bit more than that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's very difficult to motivate people really with the idea of you go to work and you earn some money. That's not a very fulfilling sort of experience. It's much better for the money to be, the consequence of doing the right thing. And the great thing is that more and more these days, doing the right thing is what people are looking for. It is what employees are looking for. It's what customers are looking for, and the money follows. So it's not a sort of a nice to have. It is now central, I think, to everything that we as a population should be thinking about, because, we are limited in resource, but we are not limited in terms of ingenuity and creativity. There is always a better way of doing something, but sometimes that requires a complete reimagining of the status quo, which is challenging often. So I'm very lucky to have ended up in a place at T-Mill where, we have created the world's first circular open source supply chain for the apparel industry. To give you a little bit of background on us, so it was a business started by two brothers on the Isle of Wight. And being on the Isle of Wight, I don't know if you're familiar with the Isle of Wight, but it's a very small island on the very south coast, just off the south coast of England. It's about 26 miles across, 66 miles around, and it's got the most expensive body of water to cross in the world, I believe, which is the Solent between the south coast of England and the Isle of Wight. Meter per meter, it's the most expensive body of water to cross. And so it became clear to the brothers that everything in their world was limited. Their access to people, their access to resources, all of that was limited. So if they were going to create a business, they needed to create one that was distinct from everything else that existed, i.e. it was circular rather than linear, because everything in today's world, or almost everything in today's world, is made to be thrown away, which is a very odd concept. Things are produced full in the knowledge that they're going to get thrown away at some point. And that's, in some ways, that's the goal, if you know what I mean, that the thing is thrown away, which is bizarre. You buy, you as a business spend money on a bottle, and in that bottle you put a liquid and you sell that bottle and liquid as a drink. And then they throw away that bottle and you have to use the profits from having sold that thing to buy more bottles. Whereas surely, the bottle is something that should go round the loop and come back to you. As an example, we take the same approach to apparel and to our clothing. Every single item we produce is made to come back to us and be remade into new products for new people. And really, what the brothers did was they created this brand called Rapa Nui Clothing, which is a sustainable outdoors brand. And whilst they were building that brand, they built a whole range of tech to make products, to sell products, to fulfill products, and decided that if they were looking to have the biggest possible impact on the world, then the way in which they should do that is to open source the platform that they'd created so that lots of other brands could create, sell, fulfill their products on it. And now we look after about 10,000 brands, from startups to charities to influencers to corporates, who are all using this circular supply chain to produce their goods and sell them. And when you think about the apparel industry, it's the second most polluting industry behind energy. 10% of all CO2 or climate gases emissions are produced by the apparel industry. Basically, 60% of all clothing is made of some form of plastic, and only 1% of any apparel is recycled, which means that 99% of it goes to this end state of either being burnt or being buried, neither of which are particularly good options. And it means that a dump truck, a 40-ton dump truck rubbish lorry full of apparel is being burnt or buried every second in the world, which is an absolutely terrifying stat. And the main reason for that is that the vast majority of the apparel industry is produced speculatively on a supply-led basis rather than a demand-led basis. So we produce huge amounts of stock in a range of sizes with a range of designs, and 4 out of every 10 t-shirts, so 40% of all t-shirts, go immediately in the bin without having been worn by anyone, because they are the wrong size, the wrong design, the wrong combination of size and design. So they are outliers and just get immediately binned, which is terrifying. So what we have done is created something which is demand-led rather than supply-led. And all of our products, our many millions of products, they don't exist digitally until they are bought by someone, at which point we produce that item because the customer has asked for it and we send it to them. And we can only do that by operating a single item flow. So we don't do things in batches. We've created the technology and the robotics and the AI to allow us to profitably produce items on a single flow basis. And what the brothers did very successfully is, having built all of this tech, they used the tech to reinvest in better raw materials, better inputs, better ways of doing things. So, for example, the recycled paper packaging that we use is 10 times more expensive than the plastic equivalent. And the renewable energy that we use is significantly more expensive than the carbon-based energy that we would otherwise use. And our organic cotton items are more expensive than the non-organic versions, et cetera, et cetera. So they've used tech very sensibly to generate efficiencies, to reinvest in doing the right thing, because it's a very odd situation where doing the right thing in our world is something that you have to pay extra for, you are penalized for. And I think until we get to a position where we think about costs holistically, I think that will always be the case.
So it's a sort of fascinating mindset, because if I looked at conventional wisdom, you've broken a number of rules there. So the first one is, let's put ideas out there, and until actually people, I guess in very simple terms, right? Until customers have shown you the money, right, and said, I'm prepared to buy this thing, and I put money behind that, nothing gets produced. Whereas the traditional fashion model, as you say, is I'll sort of walk into the store and see what's available, or go to the website, see what's available, but it's been produced already. And therefore that's a punt on the part of the designers and the part of the buyers that's there. So that's one rule that you've broken. The second one is that, I guess implicitly, people will pay more money for high quality things that come with it, because, as you said, it's not the lowest cost production. And then the third bit is, we're not just going to do this for ourselves, but we'll throw this over to. So there are just three examples of throwing conventional wisdom out. Because if you'd said to somebody, create a business that breaks these three rules, my guess is that somebody that worked in the apparel industry in general for a long period of time would say, well, that's silly, right? These are sort of givens that we have to do on that basis. And all those things the founders and you are basically saying, we don't have to respect those rules anymore. We can create a business on a different basis.
Yeah, so I think that's where the reimagining comes in. You need to sort of start from the end point, trying to work out what you're trying to achieve and work backwards, rather than starting with the norm and the way in which things are currently done and work forward. I think the sort of fourth element to this is that, and I know you're wearing one of our hoodies at the moment, but if you look on the label, you will see that there is a QR code that you scan once you've worn the item to death, let's say, or worn it out, where you can send it back to us free post. We will put it round the loop again, and we will send you a discount off your future purchases from us, because what we're trying to do is obviously build relationships with people. We're trying to ensure that we are displacing some of the less sustainable options that are out there, and ensuring we therefore positively impact the apparel industry as a whole. But yes, you're absolutely right. The industry is very set in its ways, that it does things. And it's, when you actually look at the way in which we do things, I think something like only 2% of the opportunities that exist for a business model like ours in the apparel industry are being taken advantage of. And that isn't necessarily to say that they are the green options of that thing, but those are demand-led models rather than supply-led models. And we, for complete clarity, obviously we have a range of products that we have produced in terms of the blanks. So a white t-shirt or a black t-shirt, but they are fairly common items that we then apply the branding or the logos or the designs of the 10,000 or so brands that we work with. So whilst, we are producing some items, it is massively de-risked, and the chance of it becoming waste is almost negligible because of the huge range of brands that we work with, and therefore the massive market or demand market that there is out there for those products. So yeah, that's really where some of the magic happens.
So letting other people into your access to your supply chain and technology. I mean, if I take that, what you've just highlighted there is that comes with a benefit, a societal benefit, right? Which is that lots of people are going to want black t-shirts with something on it. So you'll produce those, and then you'll let them in and have access to those. Otherwise, they would have to go and create their product in its entirety. And so there's a very collaborative thinking here, which is we're just facilitating other people to do what they want to do, and we'll do it in a way that allows them to meet their specific needs. We're not overstocking. And I'm fascinated because, again, if I looked at traditional business logic, it feels sort of, you could say it's a sort of slightly hippie-ish business model where we'll get on with everybody, we'll let everybody in. That feels if I was a hard-nosed business person, that's not the first thing I might go for. And yet the way you described it is it seems to work, right? It seems to play to a basic human idea of collaboration and cooperation.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think what is the proverb? If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And I think that's basically what we're saying is I think people focus too much on the first mile, let's say, and how quickly they can get to the first checkpoint. Whereas actually success globally and as a population depends on us solving some really critical issues. And they're only becoming ever more terrifying, actually. And apparel and waste is very much at the top of that list, or one of the certainly in the top few issues that we face. And our view is that collaboration is the best way to solve problems. And as I said at the start, businesses that do the right things tend to do well economically as well. So whilst there are good human reasons for doing it and good environmental reasons for doing it, as a business person, it still makes sense. So it's not as if it's entirely out of the goodness of our heart, because if those brands decide to do it in a particular way, hopefully they'll partner with us. And whilst it's free to use the software, clearly, there is some profit to be made in us producing those items for them. So it's just an example of working together with people to try and displace some less good practices with some better ones. And hopefully, we get rewarded for that by growing, having great impact, but also, making some money along the way too.
You talk a lot about circularity and circular thinking. So this idea that we, recycling at its most simple level, so nothing goes to waste. And your example of the bottle, I think, was a good one. And I've heard you talk about that can sometimes be difficult for people to get their heads around. And so you came up with a quote that I think is great, which I'd love you to explain, which is triangles form circles too. Can you just explain what that means? Because I think it's really interesting.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of talk about circularity these days, and that, I guess, basically, at its simplest means repurposing items and ensuring that your products go round the loop so that they become your raw materials and your raw materials become your products, et cetera, on and on and on. So we have this odd sort of terminology, which is called a suplustomer, which means our suppliers are our customers, our suppliers are our customers. So in many ways, our customers are sort of holding the item for us, and then we buy it from them, and then we sell it back to them. We buy it from them, we sell it back to them. So they hold it for us for as long as they need it, and then they send it back. So that's a sort of a 360 degrees cycle of the material flow. And ideally, you keep the material in flow for as long as possible and in use for as long as possible. But there are other ways of creating circles, or at least there are other ways of going 360 degrees. Another way of going 360 degrees is with a triangle shape rather than a circle shape. And I think people get concerned that, we're a linear business. We would need to completely rethink our entire model to be more sustainable, to be more forward thinking, to eliminate waste. But to the earlier point of collaboration, actually, all you really need to do is to try and find businesses to partner with where your product is their raw material and their raw material turns into a product that is a raw material for another business and one other leg to create the three legs of a triangle, and you've gone the full 360. So it isn't necessarily that you need to do everything yourself. And, there are elements of our business model we don't do ourselves, but I think you need to find the right people, partner together, and think about the material flows holistically so that you are producing things which are capable of being disaggregated into elements that can be used again in that process, because it is quite difficult to separate an omelette. If you've got egg whites, egg yolks, let's assume you don't have butter and milk in there just for simplicity, and you mix them up, it's actually quite difficult to unscramble that, no pun intended. And if you chuck in spring onion or ham or cheese or whatever you're partial to, it becomes exponentially more difficult. So the process is the way we think about things, and where I think product design comes into this is that you need to think about things as simplistically as possible and to try and use pure materials as much as possible, and to ensure that the form of an item follows function. So you're not embellishing it unnecessarily. You're not creating decoration, which is by definition not part of the function. It's part of the decoration. It is therefore, surplus to real requirement and is just waste, really. But if you can create things that are simple, where form follows function, there's no decoration, it's single items or single materials, then it becomes much easier to repurpose that and to put that round the loop. As soon as you start introducing mixtures, it gets hard, really hard. And if you start creating really complicated mixtures, it becomes impossibly hard. And so I think if you start at the product design point where you think really hard about what do people actually need, and can I put more effort in front to remove a zip or remove a toggle or remove a button, or, on an old radio or many radios, there's no on button. There's just a volume knob and you turn it up and that turns it on. You don't need an extra dial for on or an extra button for on. It's just superfluous. That sort of thinking needs to be applied to everything so that create something very simple, which is capable of going around the loop. And that makes things, so much easier.
And that leads to a form of collaboration that, again, might not fit into a classic business model, right? If I look at capitalism as a simple thing, there's a strong element of competition, and competition is a good thing. You're talking much more about a collaborative model, and clearly, if someone is your supplier, that's fine. But if I take your triangle, it's that sort of third leg, for want of a better phrase. And obviously, triangle is just illustrative, right? There could be 4, 5, or 6 of these things. It doesn't matter. You can have a hexagon or whatever.
Absolutely.
That leads to a form of business collaboration that, again, doesn't necessarily come naturally to people.
Well, I think that is true, because I think people are thinking only about turning their raw materials into waste. And I think people need to be motivated to think more holistically and more in a more circular fashion. And I think that's where trying not to get political or, talk about too many things that I have a limited understanding of, this is where I think some form of intervention is required. I think it is necessary for people to think, or businesses to think, about the waste that they create, and for that to be costed into the product that they are producing. And whether that is the waste that they are generating through the energy source that they are using, or the materials they're using to make their product, whatever it happens to be, but to think holistically about their impact as a business on the world and costing that in, so that the cost of pollution or cleaning up the pollution is part of the production cost of the product. I think that really focuses the mind on, do we really need that? Or can we build this out of something that is more durable and therefore will last longer? Or can we think about how to put in an end-of-life solution, which means that we won't need to pay for the cost of pollution because there is no pollution. The waste becomes the raw material in a number of steps that are all joined together. I think people need to be motivated to collaborate, to see the economic sense in why that is a better solution than competition. And whether that's a carbon tax, whether that's a different way of implementing a similar sort of approach, I don't know exactly what the solution should be, but I think until people feel an element of pain, or until they're given a framework within which to operate, I think only a few will take the untrodden path and think about their own situation more holistically, or, in a more circular way.
I think it's really interesting, because if you look at examples of where there has been intervention, if I take, for example, charging people for plastic bags, right? Very small charge of in the UK, 5p, I think it's now gone up to 10p. If you want a plastic bag in a store, you have to pay for it. For the average consumer, that seems like a small amount of money. And yet suddenly, I'm not paying for that, right? I'll bring my own bag and so you drive, very small thing drives up. If I look at soft drinks, for example, imposing a sugar tax, suddenly, they find ways to make drinks that are less fattening, right? That remove sugar, that are alternatives, that are healthier. And so I think your point around intervention is a really, really interesting one. And it seems to me that when we look at why do businesses not get this and not behave in this way? Well, the answer, I think, is one, they're financially incentivized not to get it in many cases, but it's also, there's an ability to remain blind to these things, right? So I can say nice things. I can greenwash in many respects. I can say good things about my product, and I don't see what happens afterwards, right? It doesn't matter. As long as I've sold the product to people in the first place, the knock-on impact of that is not, either it's invisible to me or I don't need to care about it. And so you're playing to a very basic behavioral thing here, which is if we can make things salient, i.e. relevant to people, and drive their behavior, and that might be economically, but it might also just be a case of transparency. then suddenly we can start to say, okay, you're taking responsibility for your actions. And it's fascinating, I think, that when we, the way you talk about that is we're all accountable. If you walk a dog and the dog leaves a mess on the pavement, you're responsible for that. Societally, that's something that people still do that from time, but we've made it relevant to people, and we find people that don't do it, and we create. And so I think there's something interesting here around what you're talking about is really making things that probably, if you asked people, they know that they ought to be doing, but there are good, in inverted commas, reasons why they're not, is making things that they might not be focusing on either relevant because you shine a light on them, or relevant economically, and therefore they focus on them.
Yeah, and I think there's a big part of just, creating a level playing field, because often if you are the one that goes off and does something in a different way, to a certain extent, you may be sort of kneecapping yourself slightly. It may be that you are trying to do the right thing and it costs you more to do the right thing. So in our example of, organic cotton or renewable energy or recycled packaging, all of those things are more expensive. So day one, it's a challenge. You need to find ways to afford those things. And your products, until you've generated those efficiencies, your base cost is more. So in theory, at least, you need to charge more for it. But as those efficiencies come through, you can bring that down, et cetera, et cetera. But if everyone is in the same boat, if the frameworks have been set, if the rules of engagement have been set, then it's a level playing field. And I think there'll be a lot of people out there who just breathe a bit of a sigh of relief. Finally, I can do the thing I know we as a business need to do to solve the societal problems that we have. And I know that no one else is going to have a competitive advantage now because they can't do it either. So we can all work more collaboratively together, or we can all iterate or evolve our offering within a much more sustainable framework. And I think that is a good thing. So I think the role of government, the role of bodies, whatever it happens to be, is to create frameworks that are in, the right interests, and let competition or research and development take care of the rest. People, in my experience, tend to want to do the right thing deep down, some more deep down than others. But at the same time, I think if you can flatten the playing field for people, that does make it easier.
I'm intrigued that when people come to you, clearly it's a key component of your offering that you have this environmentally friendly, sustainable dynamic. But if you made that difficult for me, i.e. you didn't allow me to produce small batches or on demand, that might make it a bit more favorable. So what I think is nice about what your model is, it combines both doing the right thing, but it's facilitating doing the right thing. And so I wondered, as customers come in, these things presumably are equally important.
Yeah, I mean, what do customers want? They want to be understood. They want us to add some value, and they want us to make it simple. Those are the three things that I think any customer wants: is understand who I am, what I need, what I want, add some value through the thing that you do, and then make it easy for me to do that thing. And we try and make it as easy as we possibly can. I mean, you might decide you want to buy a t-shirt from us. You might decide you want to buy 1,000 t-shirts from us. You might decide that you want to offer t-shirts alongside podcasts, or t-shirts alongside bottles of fizzy drink, or you might decide that you're an artist and looking to promote your music or your creative or whatever it happens to be. We have lots of different ways of making it easy for you. A bulk order, that's fine. A single t-shirt, that's fine. An integration with your e-commerce platform, that is fine too. We try and handhold at every step. We produce the right base cost items. We make the products in the right way. We ship them and fulfill them in a way which is completely hands-off from your point of view. So it's super simple, and we make it a very seamless customer experience. So whether or not you're buying single items, or whether or not you're buying items together with anything else that you currently sell, it's just a very easy option for people. And the sustainability piece, the ease piece, and the competitive nature of the product, all of those things is quite a compelling offer, I would say. And the pièce de résistance, the cherry on the top, is the fact that it is circular, and our items stay out of the loop and never end up in landfill, which is not what you can say for the vast majority of the offerings out there. If you can save that 40% that I talked about earlier, 4 out of 10, that's a massive efficiency, even before you start thinking about the circularity of the product.
And what you've beautifully identified there is you're making it easy for me to do the right thing.
Yeah.
Right. It's not like I don't know. Yes, I can order from you, but I have to order 1,000,000 t-shirts. Or, yeah, but sure, we'll yeah, yes, you can sell individual ones, but that's your problem, not ours. And so you've kind of recognized that if we want to change people's behavior and get them to do something, and so from an environmental perspective, but also from business perspective, gone, okay, let's think about things from the customer's perspective and say, how do we deliver something that they will find compelling? And in doing that, we grow our business, but we also deliver this environmental objective. But you've recognized that basic point that if it's too difficult for people, I guess in the same way that if it's too difficult for businesses to do the right thing, then they won't. You've recognized that key human dynamic, right? Which is think about things from the perspective of the person that's using your service in order to be able to get their attention and ultimately get their wallet.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, everything's got to start with the customer. And, I think from our side that, the key really has been the use of technology to enable us to deliver that service and that experience to people. I mean, we can pick, print and pack an item faster than most people can pick and pack an item. Yeah. And it's, every single item that is printed here is automated in such a way that, the layout of our factories is such that one of our pickers would have to travel the least distance to find that item. It all then goes down a sort of a robotics controlled conveyor system, printed digitally with effectively the design files being replicated on the garment without any manual intervention, and then similarly packed and sent out same day. So it's a very highly automated system that anyone without any training, because of the intelligence that's built into the system, could basically walk up to it day one and get going whilst being effectively instructed as to how to carry out those tasks there and then without any need for any real prior training. So it's an incredibly impressive system. I would say that, I guess, but, being relatively new to the business myself, I turned up and I've always come from backgrounds where the businesses have always been very tech-centric, customer-centric businesses. And I was amazed by the extent of the technological sophistication that is at the heart of Tima.
You and I have talked about design before, and we can talk about design in terms of the product design. But the point to me has always been that we need to think about these things from the get-go, right? Because a lot of solutions, it seems to me, are kind of we've created something that's not great, so let's try and add on something that makes it a bit better. So let's recycle. Oh god, we're producing all this waste. Let's try and recycle that somehow. And the way you've just articulated it is it's really thinking about things from the outset, right? So the process and the product are all designed with that mindset. It's not a case of kind of bolting something on. And I often feel that when we look at organizations, if we look at sort of corporate social responsibility in the loosest possible sense, it's like, oh god, our business isn't great from a social perspective. Let's just let's send employees out to paint a school playground or something, right? We'll just add that on, or we'll fund some project somewhere. And it always feels a bit bolt on. But what you've just described is a business that's been built from the ground up with that mindset. So your production process sits core to the values. And I think what's really interesting here is if one is starting again in the 21st century, there's no excuse for not thinking in these terms. Clearly, the challenge we've got is that lots of legacy business models and thinking and structures are designed on a completely different basis, and they don't have that at their core.
Yeah, so I think that's absolutely true. I think I was talking to a group of business students from Bath University the other day, and one of the things I said to them was, and this may not be that sensible, but I'll say it anyway. Obviously, when you are at that stage in your career, at the start of your career, it is very helpful to be able to see people that you aspire to be, people that you can relate to out there in the world, that you think, I'm a bit like them. I could do that. I would like to do that. I aspire to be that type of person in that type of role. So I think it is helpful to be able to see things exist that you aspire to be. On the flip side, though, I think it can be a challenge. I think it's quite difficult for people who have been ingrained in an industry to have sufficient a helicopter view to think in a revolutionary way and to redesign something from from the outcome backwards, from the end point backwards, because it just takes a complete mindset shift. So I think my confidence is really in young people who have not been influenced too much by the ways in which things have always been done, because there is a freedom of thought there. So I think whilst it can only be what you can see, yes, but in some ways we don't want to be what you can see, because actually what you can see is not the answer. So I think that sort of argument works both ways, if you know what I mean, because the solution to many of the problems is a complete reimagining. And sometimes it's helpful to not start with the existing system, but to start with a complete blank piece of paper and say, what are we looking to achieve? Okay, great. Well, if that's the case, how would we logically design that if, money were no object, or we had all of the tech capability, or all of the AI, or all the robotics? Okay, fine. Well, we can do this bit, that bit, that bit. This bit's a bit challenging. So let's work on that. Who else knows how to do that? Who can we collaborate with? And then build a system which works 360 degrees, and then say, right, are we going to do all of this ourselves? So we're going to partner with these guys, or we're going to partner with those guys. And if you're doing that, fundamentally, the whole world is panicking, understandably, about all of the issues that it faces. But when you look at humanity is capable of solving, and has solved, some humongously difficult situations and challenges. And, we can solve everything that's in front of us, I'm sure, but we need to get going, and we need to reimagine things. We need to think more collaboratively. So I think it is all about putting in pre-work rather than rework, as we say here. Let's do the thinking up front before diving into things. I think it's always tempting to go, okay, we got to start, so let's do something. Whereas actually, the more time with a blank sheet of paper or a whiteboard or whatever, I think that really is valuable, because once you've built something, it's much harder to re-engineer it, to your point. And when you're at the end of that process, it's incredibly difficult to go back and sort of break it up and start again. So pre-work prevents the rework at the end, which in many cases is nigh on impossible.
And I thought that was a really interesting analysis there with the inherent contradiction around, well, we need there to be role models, right, for you to know this is feasible. But we also, to your point, we don't want you to slavishly follow those role models, right? We want you to go beyond that. And as you were talking, I thought actually the two things fit together quite nicely, because on the one hand, you're sort of saying, well, I need you. The reason you need a role model, right? You can't be what you can't see, which makes perfect sense, right? If my sort of person has never done that, nobody in my family's ever been to university, I can't possibly go. Well, we need to kill that kind of stupid thinking. And so what we're trying to do there is break out of orthodox thinking and say, actually, look, let's try and find some role models that show you it can be done. But then we don't want you to be constrained by those role models. So it's all of it, I think, is around opening human minds and saying we need to let's just ask some really good questions and say, and let's not assume that things are not possible. And I think what's really interesting is, you just sort of listed a whole load of technologies. Technology is a game changer, right? And AI is just the latest incarnation. If we look at factories and the internet in itself was a, and so a lot of conventional wisdom, sometimes it's conventional wisdom, common sense and ways of doing things. They exist for a reason. But I think in many cases, right, those rules are being broken. Those rules existed for an analog world in very simple terms, and we're now in a digital world. And so we have that capability to break out. So I think what you said was very smart, because what we're trying to do is, in both cases, we're trying to open human minds and say, be more creative, ask questions. Don't assume that the way that you think it's always been done is the way it has to be done, because that's how we get these interesting shifts. So I thought that was super smart, because it's kind of like, you want to unleash people, but you don't want to unleash them only to become the things that they can see. That needs to continue.
I totally agree. We want to show that it's possible, but not limit what is possible. And I think that is absolutely the key. Show me a free thinker. Show me someone that questions, someone who asks the 5 whys, not just, accept the first answer, but question that too, and really get to the nub of why something is happening in that particular way, and then evaluate whether or not that is, the way in which it should happen, or the outcome that we want. And if it isn't, reimagine it in a completely different way. So yeah, I'm not sure it is necessarily the best way of thinking about it, but I thought about it on the spot when I was talking to the people with the students at Bath, and I just thought it's is going to take some revolutionary thinking and sometimes coming at it from a completely fresh approach, whether that's, you're in an industry and you move into another industry, or you're in a business, and you move into another business. It's often in that early stage where you have the greatest clarity before you become unencumbered with, or encumbered rather with, all of the intricacies of that thing.
I love the way you talked about it, because you look at what's your role when you're talking to students in that scenario, right? Your role is not to replicate the advice they've had from careers. I always laugh at the concept of like careers master I used to have at school, right? It's like, what do they know about careers, right? They've never left school. So it's like, it's not, but I love it. But you're there to bring a different perspective, right? And so in many respects, if you turn around and go, I'm not sure that's the best possible, I think it is, right? Because they won't hear radical thinking necessarily from the sort of traditional sources.
Yeah.
And so you need to bring these fresh perspectives in to get people thinking differently about it. And I think, what is really interesting, we keep coming back to this, is conventional wisdom has its values. And I do think one needs to understand it, right? In order to do the disruptive bit, you have to understand the logic behind the traditional model and why that makes sense, because there may be some things that are, the law of physics isn't going to change, right? So there are certain dynamics when we're dealing with the physical world, the safety rules, for example. That's probably not a space where we want to be cutting any corners.
Agreed.
Right, they're very sensible, but there are lots of other things that are up for grabs to questioning. So we need to understand, right, how is this being done at the moment? Why is that being done? And then I can start to ask all sorts of questions. And just because it's been done like that for 1,000 years doesn't mean that that's the right thing for the next 1,000 years.
I agree with that, and I think money is a very sort of meaningful motivator for people. So turning things into pounds and pence and saying, if you do this in that way, it will be more expensive ultimately, and therefore you will be less competitive, and therefore you will sell less, makes people rethink quickly how they do things. And I think that can really encourage better behaviors, for sure. And my advice actually too, so one of the last questions I had from the students was, what advice would you give us, about our careers and what we should think about? And actually my advice slightly took me by surprise, because it was to not worry too much, because I have found that things do have a way of working themselves out if you focus on, working with organizations, with purpose, with smart people who are open-minded rather than closed-minded. And don't worry if, witchcraft leads you to accountancy, because, life is, whilst it's short, it's long enough for you to have more than one iteration or more than one vocation, or, it is capable to build transferable skills and to find yourself ultimately moving in a very positive direction, even if that is one that sort of zigzags between sectors or companies or whatever it happens to be. As long as I think you keep a North Star, which is, that life has to be more than just about making money. Money is a consequence. Money is not the reason for doing anything. I think if you keep that and you work with smart people and you're open to ideas, it will sort itself out. And I think stressing about it too much is perhaps not that useful. Normally it's the things you don't worry about that are ultimately the problem, not the things you do worry about. Probably because you've created some plan for the things that you do worry about, in fairness, but I think
I'm struck, as I pull all this together and I think about your career. So we go from something very sensible, right, and very simple terms, right, a trade, a profession, and literally, and a professional qualification to go with it. And I'm smiling because I have this, similar sort of path, right? And then you step out into this, what you could look at as a slightly anarchic world, right? And accountants that are listening to this are going to hate this, but I'm going to say it anyway, right? It's a sort of a slightly more rigid thinking, structured processes into something where the wheels are off and you've got much more freedom. And some of that's a function of the nature of the business you're in, some of the industry that you're in. And I was really struck by that transition and how much you feel that your career, in terms of having a structure early on, has helped you now. Because it seems to me that right now you need to be thinking creatively, the way that you talked about circularity, there's some really innovative thinking going on, and you're talking to lots of different people, you're getting lots of different in a way that you might not have done in the past. How much is the sort of the formal training, is that helpful in what you're doing, and how much is it a hindrance? I mean, it's undeniably a part of who you are, right? So you can't sort of disaggregate it. But I'm just intrigued as to when you look back, because implicitly in what you were saying, it wasn't a waste of time. And I'm sort of just trying to draw the threads in your career and say how much of it was like a misspent early career and how much of it was useful.
Well, I mean, I guess I've sort of glossed over, a little bit, the 10 years I spent as CFO of either a PLC or an increasingly large private energy business. But I think a combination of arts and sciences, numbers and words, and pictures, clearly, all of that is useful. I think it's having as sort of rounded a view helps you take a rounded view. I think is in a world of circularity, you want to think about things from all angles if you're going to reimagine something. So I think the business side of things during the accountancy training, during the practical application of that, has been incredibly useful in terms of understanding just how business works, the inputs, the outputs, what makes something sustainable and workable. That's been incredibly helpful. I think equally, the difficult thing in life, clearly you need to pay for things, but at the same time, people are both your greatest asset and the problem that you need to solve. It's their actions in one way or another which either create the solution or create the problem. And an understanding of people and what makes people tick and how to get the best out of them. That's the thing that I've probably found. I'm no expert in it. I'm constantly learning and, making mistakes every day, but hopefully learning from a few of those too. But that's the thing which I think, really makes me tick, is having the opportunity to get the best out of really bright people, far brighter than me. But, if I can be someone that facilitates them to do their best work, then for me, that's a really rewarding thing. And if you take the fact that if you gravitate towards purpose-driven businesses, even better, because the people that tend to seek those businesses out equally share your view of the world. And that's a very, it's a very powerful thing. It's a very happy place to be.
Wow. I think that's I think is a fabulous point on which to finish the show, but I can't let you go without you telling everybody how they can find out more about your company, and if they want to get t-shirts or anything else printed, how they can go about doing it.
Perfect. Well, so if you want to find out more about us, please take a look at our website, which is www.teemill.com. And there you can find out all about the various options that we have. As I say, if you want one t-shirt, you want a store, you want us to do some printing for you, whatever it happens to be, come and have a look and reach out to me equally on LinkedIn or some other platform, and I'll be very happy to answer any questions that you have.
Fabulous stuff. Well, I will put links to all of that in the show notes, but all that remains to say, Chris, is I've known you for a long time, and it's been absolutely fascinating having this conversation with you, because I don't think it's the conversation we would have had if we were just sitting together over a beer. We've gone to some really interesting spaces. I've learned some things. You've provoked me to think about things in a different way, and I know you will have done my listeners as well. So thank you very much for being an amazing guest.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
So that's it for this episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to Chris for appearing, and to you for listening. To find out more about Chris, his work at Teemill and Circularity, have a look in the show notes. There are links to all of those there. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. If you've yet to leave a 5-star review for the show, please do. It helps other people to find it, and for me to continue to attract high-quality guests. Another reminder that my new book, Humanizing Rules, Bringing Behavioral Science to Ethics and Compliance, is available to pre-order now. There's a link to that in the show notes. I'll be back very soon with another episode of this show, but in the meantime, stay safe, try and promote circular thinking in your organization, and thank you so much for listening.